an evening and recommended also the combination with Yom Yerushalayim to recognize Yom Yerushalayim. Some of us might remember Rav Aharon Zatzal speaking about Yom Yerushalayim in 501 many years ago, in room 501, the fifth floor, first hall. So you can get that. I'm sure it's on YU Torah also. We'll publish somewhere. I'd like to also thank, of course, the speakers this evening, Rabbi Schonfeld, who spoke already, Rabbi Menachem Penner, our local Rabbi Mordechai Young Israel of Housewood, soon to be Rabbi Emeritus, and Dina Britz, who was a Talmud in Gush of Aharon, Rabbi Julius Berman, who was our own member, and of course prominent international leader for the Jewish people for many, many years, friend of Aharon from his days in yeshiva, a long time ago, and ever since. And Aharon, of course, we've been zocheh to have Aharon in the neighborhood, sleeping a few times since the Bermans moved in, and last Rabbi Rosensweig, Rosh Yeshiva, and Rosh Kollel, Baron Kollel Elyon and also Talmud of Aharon at Gush. Those are the speakers this evening, and we'll get to them shortly. Just a few brief remarks. One, the first time I saw Rav Aharon Lichtenstein that I remember was I went into the third floor base medrash in First Hall when he was a Rosh Kollel. I was a freshman or perhaps a sophomore in YU. And I went in and I was looking around and I saw a few different things. And I saw Rav Shefner and Rav Willig was studying b'chavrusa on one table with each other. But in the front, Rav Aharon was standing. And he was learning. And he was learning b'chavrusa with himself. He would stand and he would face this way and he would say what he said. And then he would turn and face this way and say what he said. It was kind of a remarkable experience because what's the purpose of chavrusa? The purpose of chavrusa is to make sure that you're finding the truth and you're not too biased in your own opinion. But Rav Aharon somehow is able to always express both sides of everything. And this is, anybody who's a Talmud knows that he had what they called in Israel, when I visited shortly after he went to Gush, one of my friends told me, "Hey, Ma'avim Hadar Shal Shtei Afshariyot." Everything is about the possibilities, and it's a very unique characteristic. You have to look at something from two different ways. He looked at Gemara that way, Rashi that way, Tosfos that way, life that way. I assume he also looked at Milton and all of those other, literary experts the same way. Everything was always a varied way to look at things, and I think that very much enabled him to be the Gadol that he was for all of us. Of course, we know he blended Torah, Madar, Chachma, and literature. I was zocheh to have him as my Rabbi in my junior and senior year at Yeshiva College, before I went to Israel to learn. And I remember a few things. One I shared with the members of the shul. I'm not going to share that with you, but I will share the following. I remember after the first, they didn't have report cards, but there was a grade. So when he would give a grade, I don't really understand how this worked. Because I teach at Stern, you give a grade, it's on a computer, you just put the grade in. There's no paperwork or anything. But in those days, I guess there was some kind of paperwork. I don't remember how the paperwork was, but I know that he wrote a note on the grade. So he wrote a note on the grade. And what the note was, I don't remember. That's probably a good thing. But the result was my father, Zichron Livracha, came to meet with Rav Aharon after Shir one day because he wanted to understand what it was Rav Aharon wrote in the grade. So I'm in college already. I'm a junior or senior in college already. It didn't make a difference. So that told you a little about my father. Told you also about Rav Aharon. Rav Aharon didn't say, why are you coming? He's in college, he's an adult, he's on his own. Rav Aharon understood if a father wants to come and talk about his son learning, what can be more important? And if there's some way to improve somebody's learning, that's what it's all about. And he, I think, really worked very hard not only to teach his Talmudim, but to understand every Talmud, to relate to every Talmud on their own level. Fast forward many, many years, to about 7 or 8 years ago, I was president of the Rabbinic Council of America, and we have many people to turn to, but frankly, the one single person to turn to about issues that were at hand and are still at hand was Rav Aharon Zechariah Livracha, and he would give time not only to me as a Talmud and the president of the RCA, but he would give time to anybody who needed. If you listen to any of the eulogies over, or Askaros, or any kind of remembrances over the last few weeks, you know that this is like a recurring theme. Whoever needed time to talk to him, he would talk to them. And the things that I talked to him about, frankly, were issues affecting the modern Orthodox Jewish community. And how does the RCA as a national organization relate to different issues that are going on? So I can't share with you this issue, that issue, but the global picture is the following. what do you do? How do you react when someone is maybe stepping over the bounds one way or the other? What do you do with that individual, organization, whatever it is? How do you deal with that? And he was extremely, I'll say, firm in his halachic opinions about what is mutter and what is asur. And everybody can have their opinions and so on. His opinions were not based upon a dogma, but rather on analysis of all the possibilities. And at the end of the day, if he felt someone was outside halachic boundaries, he said it's not allowed. But he also said, but you have to do everything you can to try and make sure that they stay in with us. And that was a very, very important educational principle, and it goes deep into what his character was about, and that was he was an Ohev Yisrael. He just loved every single Jew. He was like Aharon, HaKohen, Ohev Yisrael, Makavan Torah, his kiruv to the Jewish people at large, people in yeshiva, people non-yeshiva, people in all realms of Jewish society, was based on the fact that he loved each and every Jew, and his goal was to make sure that the Torah of Hashem would be promulgated, but also that the level of every single Jew in the world could be elevated. He was very cognizant also, I say, of the world at large. He understood issues. We know he was bothered by things that went on. If he felt that, we'll say, Jews were not doing the right way, or Israelis were not doing the right way, he would speak out, although it was not typical for him to speak out on those kind of issues unless he felt it was very crucial for the betterment of the Jewish people. We are gifted this evening to have, as I said, three other speakers. One of the, I think, challenges of speaking about someone of the greatness of Rav Aharon is that in many ways he was like a diamond, and a diamond has shivim panim, and it's not like shivim panim l'Torah, but a diamond has many facets. And every single individual who knew Rav Aharon Zatzal would see the facets that they saw, but every single angle that you looked at him was an angle which would give us light and give us, if you will, very much chizuk and elevate us to try and aspire to a higher level. When he came to see Rav Aharon, and I heard this word and it really bothered me, people would say they were afraid to go and speak to him. And I know what they mean, but that's definitely the wrong word. There was trepidation. Why? Because he wanted to make sure that you asked the question in a way that was intelligent, because he would analyze the question, he would have high expectation of you. So he had no fear, because he would never have any possible negative reaction to anything you said. He would be probing, but he would be elevating at the same time. And so this evening also, for me, is some evening of trepidation, knowing that it's impossible to give proper kavod to someone who was our Rebbe. When I say our Rebbe, I don't mean only my Rebbe and the Rebbe of those who were zocheh to be in his class, but all of Klal Yisrael really are his students in many, many ways, the same way as the students of Aharon HaKohen. I will stop my remarks now. Yehi Zichro Baruch. We should all be zocheh to learn the lessons of his life and bring them into our own lives in good health for many, many years to come. Rabbi Menachem Penner.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Hochberg, and thanks for organizing this event. I don't know, I was terrified. I don't know about anybody else. But I guess that's the way that a person feels when they're in front of someone who is so great. I remember sitting in the shiur, and we would be terrified as they speak about the generation before me of being in the Rav's shiur and being called on. And when Rav Lichtenstein would call on you, he'd actually call on you in a way that, in a very open-ended way very often. He'd look around the crowd, and there would be some of us Shana Bet Americans who, even if we had an answer, we'd be terrified to say it in Hebrew in front of the Shana Hey Israelis there. And he would just say, Penner, ma ta choshev? What? I don't know. I'm sitting in front of a Lichtenstein. What do I think? What do I think? I think you're giving a good shiur. What am I going to say? Rav Lichtenstein's anivos. The rabbis tell us that you see HaKadosh Baruch Hu, lahavdil, you see HaKadosh Baruch Hu is where you see his godless, is where you see his anivos. And anivos is what allows us to see godless. Those of you who know me, I'll speak in a very personal way. as one of the younger Talmidim of Lichtenstein in a certain sense. Those of you who know me well know that I'm not always in the best of health. So that didn't start when I became a rabbi. It started already when I was learning. And during Shana Bet, I was in Rav Lichtenstein's shir for a while, and then I took ill for quite some time. So I was laying in bed, and I'd spent quite a few weeks in my room. And in those days, we didn't have cell phones. We did have pay phones. And the deal was that every 3 weeks, my parents were going to call me on the payphone. Every 3 weeks, I think it was like Tuesday at 1:30, something like that, and that was just the deal. I knew to be down there and pick up the phone. So I had a high fever. I wasn't thinking about anything. And my parents called. I hadn't been in Rav Lichtenstein's shir for a couple of weeks, and I didn't really know whether he noticed I wasn't there or didn't notice I wasn't there. So one day I get a knock on the door, and the message was that I should call my parents very quickly. What happened? My parents' regular phone call, and of course, Rav Aharon, as was his way, he picked up the payphones when they rang. It's an extraordinary thing. Rav Lichtenstein picked up the payphones, which was to the horror of many of the Gush students, who was the only way to contact, they were all of marriageable age, to contact their girlfriends. And Rav Lichtenstein would routinely pick up the phone. What was amazing about it was that he would pick up the phone not because it was an act of chesed. You know, I could imagine going past the phone and thinking like, this is a way to help somebody. But Lichtenstein answered the phone for one reason, because there was no reason not to. So what if he was Rav Aharon Lichtenstein? The phone's ringing, you answer the phone. So what if you're the Rosh Yeshiva? You answer the phone. So my parents called. They said, hi, we're calling for Marc Penner. Who's this? Aharon Lichtenstein. And they said, oh, that's very nice. He said he was very much enjoying your shir. So actually, he hasn't been there for 3 weeks. And as I said, the next thing was a knock on my door and said, Rav Lichtenstein answered the phone, call your parents now. I grew up, my entire existence was to be in Rav Lichtenstein's shir. All my Rabbeim in high school had learned by Rav Lichtenstein. And that was what my career was to, my learning career was to do, was to be able to sit by Rav Lichtenstein. I even stayed in YU the first year after college for a year, because I knew that way for sure I'd be able to get into Rav Lichtenstein's shir before my parents roped me back into coming back to America. That way I was a year ahead. And yet I had never met Rav Lichtenstein. I had never met Rav Lichtenstein. I wasn't particularly aware of who the greats were in our community. And in 12th grade, I went to look at yeshivas in Eretz Yisrael. And I went to look at the Gush. I had actually never, I couldn't look him up on the internet, whatever. I had never seen Rav Lichtenstein. I didn't know who he was. And I'm coming down to lunch in the Chader Ochel. And as I'm about, it's a lot of Talmidim coming in together into the line, and everybody's kind of making their way in, and somebody yanks my arm. I almost took out my left arm, because I had almost cut Rav Lichtenstein on the line for lunch. I have to tell you that first impression of someone who would become such a mentor, that it didn't dawn on me that this person who was standing on line in the lunchroom, who was there without a beard, who was there without a tie, and who was just literally waiting online in the Chader Ochel with the rest of the Talmidim, to imagine that this was Rav Lichtenstein, it didn't dawn on me that could be. I shouldn't cut anybody, I guess, but you're talking to somebody. Rav Lichtenstein's greatness, I really believe, could be seen. I can't describe his greatness. I'm not at a level, I'm not at a place to tell you what his greatness was. But I can tell you why we could see it. And the reason why we could see it was because there was no ego there that would get in the way. There was no ego there that blocked us to be able to see who he was and to be able to see before whom he was standing. To be with Rav Lichtenstein was to be with someone who had an acute awareness that the Ribbono Shel Olam was there. Every action was calculated. Every move of his body was calculated. And yet, sometimes somebody can be so great that you actually can't see what's behind them. I mentioned this in yeshiva a few days after he passed away. Our rabbis tell us that the greatness of David HaMelech was that he could project the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu without getting in the way. We're told that Malchus Beis David is Nimshalo Lavano. Why is David HaMelech? Why do we say David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kai? Why do we say that at Kiddush Lavano? Because you know what's the hardest thing about being a king? If you're a Jewish king, if you're a Melech B'Yisrael, you have all this glory, you have all this power, and yet your role is to be invisible, so that through you people could see the Ribono Shalom. And if you look at the rise and fall of the kings, at the transfer from Shaul to David and the kings as they go on, it's very true that a Melech B'Yisrael had an almost impossible job to be great himself, and yet to have your ultimate goal to be invisible, so that people could sense who's right behind you. Ein yeshiva ba'azara el l'malchei beis David bilvad. Nobody else could sit in the azara. You can't sit in the azara. It looks like, right, the famous Gemara in Chagiga talks about Matatron sitting up in Shamayim. If somebody sits before the Ribono Shalom, so it makes you think, Chas v'shalom, there's more than one entity here. Ein yeshiva ba'azara el l'malchei beis David bilvad, because the essence of a true melech from Beis David was to be able to be there and to have you, despite that, sense not him, but what was behind him. That's Malchus. And that's what I felt like. What I felt like sitting in front of Lichtenstein. Sitting in front of him in Shir Yomi. There was a sense that you could really detect, you could really feel that if he was in the presence of the Ribono Shalom, and you were in his presence, that you were in the presence of the Ribono Shalom. I'll never forget seeing Rav Lichtenstein's face after one Yom Kippur. After Rav Amital finished Ne'ilah, two of them stood about 5 feet apart. And I'll never forget seeing Rav Lichtenstein's face. Just the radiant joy, like the Levana. Mamish, you saw something from, I felt like I saw something from a different world. The pure, simple joy that he had made it through a Yom Kippur. The joy on his face. And to see the presence somehow, to see the Shekhinah shining in that way. I don't know, and I can't describe what Rav Lichtenstein's greatness was. But I could tell you that without that anava, we wouldn't have been able to notice it. We wouldn't have been able, it would have blocked everything else. And that's how we felt sitting before him. Now the Gemara says in today's daf that when Rabbi was dying, Rabbi told one of his dying words was, V'hoshivu yeshiva la'achar shloshim yom. That the yeshiva should go back into session after 30 days. It was amazing. There seemed to be a move to have even longer than 30-day memorial period for Rebbe, where the yeshivas were going to be out of session. And Rebbe said, Moshe Rabbeinu got 30 days, so I also should get 30 days. That's the maximum you could do for me is 30 days. The Gemara says that in the morning and night, Tchlos and Yomin, Saftin b'yamamo v'leilio. For 30 days, the yeshivas were by. Can you imagine this? It wasn't like one afternoon. For 30 days straight, they just said Hespedim. They didn't learn Torah. And then after 30 days, for the rest of the year, they spent half a day with Hespedim and half a day with learning Torah. How could you rationalize that? But sometimes from the Hespedim of a great person, you can sometimes get even more than you can from just a Blat Gemara. Sometimes they probably, in hearing the stories about Rebbe, in hearing who he was, in hearing his Gadlus, they took 30 days off from learning Torah. But they were probably inspired and uplifted in a much greater way. I continue as I hear more stories of Lichtenstein to simply be uplifted, to feel very lucky that I was able to be counted amongst his many, many Talmidim, to feel very lucky that my own Rabbeim pushed me to be able to sit in his shir and to have a real Matan Torah experience of my own. Yehi Zichro V'Ro.
by Julius Berman.
How do you describe, in a few words, Aharon Lichtenstein? Brilliance as a Torah scholar, a pedagogue beyond compare, extraordinary piety, courage, and selflessness, clarity of vision and purpose. His level of intellectual honesty was matched only by his quest for emes, a man of true humility and integrity. The former Chief Rabbi of Britain, Lord Jonathan Sacks, described Aharon as, I quote, a man of great intellect, equally at home in the literature of the sages and of the world, and a master Talmudist, a profound exponent of Jewish thought, a deep and subtle thinker who loved English literature and whose spiritual horizons were vast. But candidly, I'm not here to talk about that. Certainly not this evening. I leave to others, more literate and erudite than I, to dwell on these attributes of this unique, very, very unique, multifaceted personality. It is on the next sentence by the Chief Rabbi that I want to focus for a moment. Quote, no less impressive was his stature as a human being, caring and sensitive in all and to all his relationships, one who honored his fellows even when he disagreed with them, a living role model of Jewish ethics at its best. It was 1958, a mere 57 years ago, and we were in the shir of the Rabban Shal Yisrael, Marina Rav Yosef Dov Halevi's Soloveitchik Zachenu Tzadik Levracha. We were learning Masechta Shabbos. An event took place that would make its mark in the history of the yeshiva, and I believe in the Torah world in general. It started with a rumor. Someone mentioned in the Beis Medrash that he had heard that the babe was returning to yeshiva from Harvard, having received his PhD there. Who was the babe? The old-timers told us he was Babe Lichtenstein, the young Ilui from Chaim, Berlin, but now a full-fledged Gaon in the truest sense of the word. Indeed, he was already a legend. Moreover, what is equally relevant to me at least, he was a Gaon in Midos. Looking back as the years went by, if we could only learn to emulate his conduct as he interacted with people, whether it was his late parents that I personally observed, with generations of his family, with in-laws, with Rosh Yeshiva, with any and every human being that has an occasion to meet him, we would all be richer for it. I must say a word about his relationship with his parents. Many of you have experienced it themselves. Most of you are aware, or may have even experienced, the unique, almost mesiras nefesh of Aharon for his father when the latter was blind and almost stone deaf. How Aharon sacrificed his own tefillah, in a sense, to allow his father to mekayim his chiyuv tefillah, whether or not he had one under his physical condition. That behavior has become part of the living legend of Gush. What few know, however, is the kibbud of aim by Rav Aharon that long preceded his father's sickness. When Rav Aharon and Tova went on Aliyah to Israel, his parents were not quite ready to leave America. So Rav Aharon requested that I act somewhat as a surrogate with his parents in the meanwhile. Thus I had the schia of meeting with his parents relatively frequent during a short period of time. But let me tell you, the overwhelming nachas ruach his parents had derived from Rav Aharon throughout the years was simply indescribable. To listen to them talk about their son, their young son, you would feel that they were living in Olam Haba, although it was still Olam Hazeh. During the week of Shiva, when I approached the home, of course, as one would expect, it was crowded and overflowing. But this time it was a bit different. A delegation of Arab workers at the yeshiva came to the Shiva house to pay their respects, to express in their way their sense of loss of a man who always treated them with respect as fellow human beings, who would go out of his way, at least prior to the Yom Tovim, to visit them and express the gratitude of the yeshiva and his own personally for all they did for the students of the yeshiva to make their year of study that much more comfortable. I honestly believe that I can say without equivocation that Rav Aharon fell within the very select group of Talmidei Chachamim that qualified to be allowed into the Beis HaMedrash of Rabbi Gamliel because, as the Gemara Bracha says, Tocho Kibaro, his inner character fully corresponded to his exterior. Returning to 58 and the impending return of Rav Aharon to the yeshiva, I was also warned, and you heard it before, that I shouldn't be misled by his easygoing, friendly nature. On the basketball court, he was a terror, especially under the basket. His elbows were sharp, and he played rough. Honest, but like everything he did, played to win. What a change he made in the class. While on the one hand, he was intentionally laid back and tried to blend into the rest of the class, rarely volunteering on his own, on the other hand, it wasn't long before we realized that this student was clearly different. Whenever the Rav was searching for a citation, he would look to Rav Aharon, who would immediately respond with chapter and verse. It soon became clear he was a walking encyclopedia Talmudist. Many have referred to Rav Aharon's humility and integrity. Others have described his acts of chesed and kindness. And I'm confident we can spend all evening plus just skimming the surface of the kindness he has exhibited through the years. And yet, and I say this most respectfully, I don't consider these acts chesed at all. To my mind, an act of chesed is an act that is something that is beyond the teva, l'mayla min teva, something that is a bit or a lot out of the ordinary, not necessarily expected in the normal course of conduct. But whose normal are we talking about? Certainly not Rav Aharon's. In his normal, kindness was integral. Chesed was not l'mayla min teva. It was part and parcel of his very teva, as if it was in his genes. A small, very small incident. My brother-in-law, a Talmud of Rav Aharon yet before he went on Aliyah, had arranged to have a pair of tefillin, in effect written for his son's future bar mitzvah in Gush. When the tefillin were finished, the arrangement was made that the sofer would bring the tefillin to Rav Aharon at Gush, and Rav Aharon, and his daily trip back to Yerushalayim, where he lived, would take it back with him to his home, and my brother-in-law would pick him up from the house. Unfortunately, on the day chosen for the delivery to Rav Aharon, it was raining cats and dogs, a real mabul. That afternoon, my brother-in-law, who was in the hotel in Jerusalem, hears a knock on the door. He opens it, and there stands Rav Aharon, appropriately wet from the rain, with a tefillin in hand. My brother-in-law, feeling very uncomfortable, said that the understanding was that he was to go to Rav Aharon's house to pick up the tefillin, not the reverse. Rav Aharon nonchalantly responded that he had to get wet anyway, going from yeshiva home, so why should both of them get wet? Simple logic, right? That was Rav Aharon. On the other hand, try to be nice to him. A chesed, even a simple kindness to Rav Aharon, it was nearly impossible. Before his son Yitzi moved to Muncie, Rav Aharon would stay at our house when he came to New York. The routine surrounding Rav Aharon's trips to New York 2 or 3 times a year would usually follow a familiar pattern. About a month before the trip, the calls would start coming in at home. First sporadically, then accelerating as the trip approached. The caller heard that Rav Aharon would be arriving soon, and he or she or they wished to make an appointment with him to discuss a personal matter. If Rav Aharon had been contacted in Israel, he would usually suggest that they call my wife Dottie, who was president of the Zion Foundation at the time, to arrange a meeting. Of course, Dottie had no control over Rav Aharon's schedule whatever, and she knew that much of his schedule needed to be flexible to accommodate additional tasks such as giving shiurim at the yeshiva, especially for Gush alumni, interviewing prospective applicants to Gush for the post-high school year or years, giving community lectures, delivering Orthodox Forum essays, and the like. Under those circumstances, how Dottie was able to juggle the schedule is beyond me, and I wisely, very wisely, stayed out of that area of activity. Finally, the time came, and Rav Aharon arrived in America. He would take the late-night flight from Lud and arrive early in the morning. Upon arrival, he would pick up his large suitcase from baggage claim, and together with his carry-on containing talis and tefillin and the sperm he'd need on the trip while others slept, he would take a taxi directly to the shul that I davened in at the time in Forest Hills. Usually when I came into shul, he was already there. After shul, as we were leaving, I would go over to take the suitcase to the car, but I never succeeded. Invariably, he would insist on taking the suitcase himself. This would happen time and time again. I didn't have the nerve to tell him that I was personally embarrassed, because people would see both of us walk out of shul, he with a large suitcase and heavy carry-on, and me with a set of car keys. That's bad enough. Can you imagine that someone might even assume that Rav Aharon was carrying my suitcase? Once we arrived home, Rav Aharon felt very comfortable. He knew exactly where his room was, the setup in the library for him to work at either an article for the Orthodox Forum series with which he was continually involved, or preparing one or more shiurim that he will be delivering while in New York, usually at the yeshiva, but sometimes in addition in a community setting. The problem for me, anyway, was in the kitchen. Dottie, knowing what Rav Aharon eats and drinks and what he doesn't eat and drink, had fully prepared the breakfast, so that was a non-issue. The complication arose when he finished eating. Rav Aharon insisted on washing every dish, every plate, and utensil he used, returning the uneaten food to the proper place, leaving the kitchen spotless. While my wife naturally was thankful, I was not. What a terrible example he was giving. After breakfast, I went off to work at the law firm, and sometimes Dottie had to leave for a short while to stop or to shop or keep an appointment. That left Rav Aharon all alone working on whatever he was working on, the lecture of this year. But now he had another task, answering the phone. Imagine the scene, if you will. The phone rings, Rav Aharon answers. Sometimes it's for Rav Aharon, and that works out well. But if it's not, the caller's perplexed. He knows the number he called, but he doesn't recognize the voice. So he asks, "Julie?" And Rav Aharon answers, "He's not home." The caller, the obvious question follows, "Who is this?" Answer, Aharon Lichtenstein. Dead silence. The caller is nonplussed. It takes a while until finally Rav Aharon says, "Can I take a message?" When my wife comes home, our temporary telephone operator dutifully reports to her all the messages. So tell me, folks, how many of you can afford such a high-priced telephone operator? I've learned from Rav Aharon that true friendship may go well beyond the usual social relationship of people. At times, a true friend can even divine the need of a friend and decide on his or her own to do a kindness, even a major kindness, without being asked. My father Zal was niftar on Asar B'Tevis at the end of 1987. The Kvura was to be in the cemetery of the Yeshivas Panovich in Bnei Brak, as arranged many years before by my father at the suggestion of our cousin Rav Shlomo Berman, Rosh Yeshiva in Panovich, the son-in-law of the Stipler. When Rav Aharon was informed of the Ptira, he on his own went to pick up two of my father's grandchildren attending yeshiva at the time, Gush, my son Eli and my nephew Ari, and brought them to the airport to be Mulaved, my father, to Bnei Brak. There they stopped in front of the yeshiva. Scores of the yeshiva Bachrim came out to greet them, and at the request of another cousin of mine, Rav Aharon was maspid my father, following which they proceeded to the cemetery for the Kvura. I need not tell you the substance of the hesped, although I recall it vividly, but that does not fit into the job description I was given tonight. Of course, shortly thereafter, Rav Aharon Gedarka B'Kodesh showed up at the Hakam Summit Seva and again was maspid my father. There were other such incidents, and you will hear and have heard many of them before and many of them in the future, but that's enough of my personal vignettes. Let me conclude with a relevant Dvar Torah I once heard from the Rav Zatzal. He pointed out that one could not frame a better job description for a manhig than Moshe himself in responding to his father-in-law's reprimand about Moshe's daily schedule in Chumash Shmos. Ki Elohem davar ba'ilai. This is Moshe describing his job. When they have a matter, they come to me, says the Rav. That is the manhig engaged in chesed. Whatever it might be, a personal problem, a family issue, sometime intergenerational disputes, whatever the nature of the issue, that, says the Rav, is the manhig as the Baal Chesed. But Moshe goes on. The shafati ben ishu ben re'ehu, and I judge between a man and his fellow, says the Rav. That is the manhig as a posek, whether purely halachic issues or as a dayan involving disputes between people and resolving them. That's the manhig, as I say, as a posek or a shofet. And finally, vodati eschuke olakim ve'estarasav, and I make known, I teach the decrees of Hashem and His teachings. That, said the Rav, is the manhig in his role as Melamed or Rosh Yeshiva. The Rav then went on to list a series of manhigim throughout the years and point out, with respect to each, what his specific character was proficient in. Ashrei Hador. Fortunate is the generation that has the ultimate schiyah to have as its manhig, as its moed derech, a man that in his composite personality combined all three of the attributes described and prescribed by Moshe Rabbeinu for manhigus, the Baal Chesed, the Posek, and the Rosh Yeshiva. Proficient in each, but always the warm, engaging, approachable, pleasant, cordial human being, suffused with humility and integrity. Rav Aharon represented all of our dreams of what Torah could mean in our lives. May his memory inspire us to live in his shadow to dream of his greatness and continue to be inspired by his living lessons to be a Ben or Bas Torah as the first step on the path to the ultimate goal of being an Eved Hashem. Chaval al da'avdin v'lo meshakim.
Before last speaker, just recognize Rudolf Weinberger of local Kalvei Sisot of Jamaica States, David Keane of New York Hospital of Queens. We are zoche to have Rabbi Rosensweig give shiur here every Monday night at 8:30 Gemara. So if you want to join any Monday night, please feel free to do so. We're zoche also he agreed to speak this evening. Certainly, we all recognize that he is the epitome in many ways of what all aspire to be Talmidim of Rav Aharon Zatzal. We thank him very much for sharing this evening.
Firstly, I say it's very appropriate that this evening really is taking place on this particular date. I don't know if anybody else is aware, but this is also Rav Lichtenstein Zatzal's birthday. Was on Yom Yerushalayim, which I always thought was extremely appropriate. Of course, the main theme of Yerushalayim is the theme of Ir Shechubra Lo Yachtad, the idea of a certain integrated collectivity which recognizes the diversity of Klal Yisrael on the one hand, but also understands that it's possible to integrate, and that integration is more than the sum of its parts, and is the ultimate goal, which enhances the significance of the variety that characterizes Klal Yisrael. I always thought that the fact that Yom Yerushalayim came later, but that confluence or convergence took place was something that was really a kind of hashgacha. This week's parsha, Aharon B'chukosai, the second parsha, B'chukosai, begins, as we all know, with a very quixotic pasuk. In B'chukosai selechu, the es mitzvosai tishmoru, va'asisa mosam. And of course, the simple reading of the pasuk is that we're referring here to chukim. We all know that there are different divisions, different genres in the Torah. We're all familiar with the difference between chukim and mishpatim. Chukim represent certain mitzvos which are intellectually more challenging. We may say that they have an inner logic, but at the same time, certainly they belong to the world of Shmiras HaMitzvos. But Rashi, of course, quotes the famous words of the Torah's Kohanim that suggest that in B'chukosai Telechu refers not to Shmiras HaMitzvos at all, but to the immersion in Talmud Torah. Yochol Zeh Kiyum HaMitzvos Ukesheomer, the next part of the pasuk, the Es Mitzvosai Tishmoru, Harei Kiyum HaMitzvos Amur, Hamani Mekayim Im B'chukosai Telechu, Shetiu Amelim Batorah. This is the obligation to be Amelim Batorah. This is a well-known expression. Even Tinokos Shel Beis Rabban are familiar with the idea of Amelus Batorah. In recent times, like everything else, they've put it to music. We all know this phrase, but translating it is extremely challenging. What really is Amelus Batorah? It's one of those almost ineffable terms that Chazal use that too are more than the sum of its parts. Certainly it refers to toil and perseverance. That has to be the beginning. But if that's all that it was, it certainly would be inadequate, and certainly wouldn't justify the connection to chukim, whatever that is, and the fact that this precedes and really defines the connecting relationship with Shmiras HaMitzvos. Toil and perseverance are indispensable steps, but certainly they're not a goal in and of their own right.
Probably a better translation for amelus is the idea of total immersion, an absolute and holistic commitment to Torah, intellectually, but especially experientially, and a translation of that into the next part of the pasuk, Shmiras HaMitzvos. Rashi himself continues, on V'im mitzvosai tishmaru, hevu amelim batorah, he repeats again, al menas lishmar ulekayim, kemoshe nemar, v'limaditem osam, u'shmartem la'asosam. In the Sifra itself, it adds that a person who is involved in lilmod shalom menas la'asos, noach shelo nivra, extremely very problematic in a way, indictment of such an individual. Better he not be born than that he be immersed in Torah, but not for the purpose of fulfilling the mitzvahs. And the question is, again, why the centrality of this idea of amelus, its ambiguity, its multiple meanings, this inverted connection with Shmiras HaMitzvos, why the connection to chukim, and why the chukosai plural as well? I always thought, not just in the last almost month, but always from the time that Zachisi, I merited to be a Talmud of Mori Rabbi, of Aharon Lichtenstein, Zechrono Livracha, almost from the first day, that the epitome of Amelus Batorah, in all of its multiple meanings, really was embodied, by his persona in every sense. Of course, it begins as a quantitative idea, with effort, toil, the perseverance that we spoke of before. But it's important to understand that perseverance and effort, as I said before, have to be wedded with something much more. The Mishnah Novos tells us, and the Rambam in Perek Gimel of Hilchos Talmud Torah codifies this, that becoming a Talmud Chacham, the goal of learning is to be involved in the keser of Torah, which is Ola al Gabeim, which is even more impressive than the keser of Malchus and the keser of Kahuna. One might have thought that the Amol part and the Malchus part were two completely different aspects. We don't normally associate nobility, a regal bearing, Malchus, which a Talmud Chacham, a true Talmud Chacham, really achieves, man malchi rabbanon. We don't associate that with hard work and perseverance per se and effort. But that really, kachi darka shel Torah, is what's unique about Torah. The democratic character of the Keser Torah, something with Rav Lichtenstein really embodied. You heard numerous stories before about his humility, about his way that he related to every and all Jews, the way that he conducted and just his general bearing, his personal bearing, on the one hand was democratic, and on the other hand was the embodiment, because of its democracy, because of its roots in toil and in perseverance, in Man Malchi Rabbanan. The Rambam himself, in Perek Gimel of Hilchos Talmud Torah Halacha Zayin, integrates these two ideas. Shema Tomar Adsha Kabetz Momo, before that, Mishanas O Libo Lekayim Mitzvah Zu, the mitzvah of Talmud Torah Kiraui, Vilios Muchtar Bekisra Shal Torah, and to achieve the crown of Torah, to be Man Malchi Rabbanan, Lo Yasiach Daito Lidvarim Acherim, Lo Yasima Libo Sheikne Torah Ima Osher V'Kavod Kiachad, Kachi Darka Shal Torah, Pas B'Melech Tochal, Ala Aretz Tishan, and so on. U'B'Torah Tia Amol, V'Lo Alecha Hamalacha Lignar, V'Lo Ata Ben Chorim Levatel. The Rambam integrates as one the concept of Amelus Batorah and the Keser Torah. And the question is, how does that happen? It begins, as I said, with toil and with perseverance. Rabbi Hochberg described Rav Lichtenstein preparing for a shiur or learning on his own. I never saw the self-chavrusa part, but anybody who was zocha to be a Talmud of Lichtenstein, whether it was here in New York or in Alon Shvut, in Yeshivat Har Etzion, would never forget the picture of him sitting at his table and the pure toil and perseverance and hard work that was written on his brow, in his face. Again, he would sit there. I didn't see the standing and the walking, with two different people, but talking to himself, formulating things, being doche, being refining. That effort was really something that was inimitable and something which was unforgettable. Rav Lichtenstein prepared for every single shiur. Remember, he was once telling me that he was working on a sefer, which I understand is soon to come out, and that, it had fallen behind schedule, and that some of his family members were a little critical about that, which I certainly can understand. And he said, I tried to explain to them, tomorrow's shiur always comes first. And this was a statement which didn't surprise me in the least. To know Rav Lichtenstein is to know that no matter how many times he learned the sugya again before he publicly gave any shiurim, out of respect for the material, out of respect for the audience, given the possibility that maybe he'd find a new nofech, some other element to define, to develop. His love for learning, his chavivas haTorah, and his respect for the material were such. That was part of the amelus, the toil, and the perseverance that every shiur had to be prepared for. That, notwithstanding a prodigious memory, the fact that all of his shiurim were really worked through in such a way, in terms of their rigor, in terms of their scope and their range, that likely conclusions were not going to change, certainly not radically. But that was part of the amelus shel Torah. I think it simply would have been inconceivable to him not to prepare for every single shiur. The actual presentation of the shiur reflected that amelus as well. Again, you could see the hard work just visually. I don't think intentionally, but you could see him grinding through the topics, really thinking as he was formulating it. Again, a sense that this is the most important thing that anyone could be doing. In this sense, the merging of amelus as toil and perseverance, together with amelus as pure immersion. The methodology of his teaching, and this is something to speak about at another occasion, reflected not only his Yiras Shamayim, but again, this sense of amelus in a maximal way as well. He didn't take the easy way out. Everything was done with a structure, an a priori structure that preceded the material that was being analyzed, a methodological focus. Again, almost the march through Shas, sugya after sugya after sugya, the regular yeshiva mesechtas, and the special shiurim in Zroim and in Taros and in Kodshim. The amelus shel Torah was absolutely incredible. But, as I say, it wasn't just hard work, and certainly wasn't just quantitative. It was where quantity really redefined quality. Singular insight on the basis of all of this amelus, seeing the entire totality of the Shas as one. We used to joke sometimes, Rabbi Lichtenstein used to carry his Shas around with him whenever he'd go to a shiur. Rabbi Berman mentioned before that it was hard to get him to allow you to carry a suitcase. I also had that experience now and then. You couldn't get him to allow you to carry his Shas either. But he used to drag this Shas around, and people used to joke that it's, Ashrei mi shaba, the Talmudo biyado. But literally, the shiurim, both in preparation and the giving of the shiur, the focus of the shiur was really Shas-oriented. It really took in the full range, not only of the possibilities, but of the possibilities that presented themselves from the looking of the topic beyond the topic to the parallel topics, to the bigger picture, again, more than the sum of its parts. And that is something which required credible mastery of the material, which of course stemmed from, radiated out of the toil and the perseverance, but especially had to be put together by a special intellect, but by a special neshama even more so, by means of that sense of total immersion the other meaning of Amelus. Rabbi Lichtenstein used to like to quote very much the Rambam's formulation in Sefer HaMitzvos about Avas Hashem, where the Rambam explains that a person who's really Ohev Hashem, a person who loves the Ribono Shel Olam, is somebody whose excitement and whose intensity flows over enthusiastically into the way that he presents the material and presents himself and presents the Ribono Shel Olam to others. Avraham Ohavi is, of course, the paradigmatic example. Avram Megayeres Hanashim, Sarah Megayeres Hanashim, that sense of enthusiasm and exuberance. Rabbi Lichtenstein, as a person, was much more reticent and reserved. You had to know him to understand his exuberance and his excitement. But that amelus, that inability to leave any corner that might produce evidence of Dvar Hashem, a perspective, a wider view, a connection, that was his enthusiasm. That was his Avraham Ohavi moment. That was the spillover of the enthusiasm of being a true Amel Batorah. And this, of course, led to the next element, the next dimension, and that is the Man Malki Rabbanan, the Kisra Shel Torah, as the Rambam explains in Perek Gimel, Halacha Zayin. In fact, Rambam goes on to explain, based again on the Mishnah and Avos, but with his own twist, if a person says, L'kishe'efne eshne, when I have time, I'll learn Torah. But meanwhile, there are other things that I have to be doing, not other spiritual things, but other human things. Such an individual, says the Rambam, will never be zocheh to the Keser of Torah. It's a fascinating Rambam. The Rambam went beyond the Mishnah in Avos. One could have said that if a person is going to leave to chance his development as a Talmid Chacham, then there's a chance that he won't achieve Kisra Shel Torah. If you want to guarantee, if you want to secure that result, then it's necessary to exclude any kind of risk when it comes to attaining the goal. But the Rambam says much more than that. The Rambam says anybody who puts this goal at risk for sure cannot attain the goal and the crown. The crown of Torah is directly connected, as I say, radiates out of the sense of amelus and the sense of yegiya. And if a person gives up on the latter, he'll never achieve the former. Rabbi Lichtenstein, Man Malki Rabbanan, was somebody who, as alluded to before, was extremely accessible from his point of view, but in some cases, many Talmidim felt a certain reserve or reticence, found it difficult to waste his time, found it formidable to approach him. And the reason I think is because of this Man Malki Rabbanan. Didn't want to disappoint him. I think it was said before, you didn't want to formulate your question, unintelligently, not only because he'd analyze it, but also because the way that he perceived you mattered. There was a sense that despite his democratic nature and his empathy and his humanity, all of which were described here so beautifully before, in the end of the day, that is the prescription, that is the formula for Man Malki Rabbanan. But in the presence of somebody who is truly great and stands for things and is immersed in what he believes in, and is an Avraham Ohavi reflected by that enthusiasm and the effort and the investment that he puts in it, you don't want to waste that person's time. You don't want him to be disappointed in your not only intelligence, but especially in your spiritual quotient, etc. Therefore, while he was certainly accessible, and I have to say that on a personal level, I have tremendous hakaras hatov. All the years from the very first day that I was a Talmid, Lichtenstein was extremely generous with his time and with his encouragement. It had a tremendous transforming impact on my life, and this is true for hundreds and hundreds of other Talmidim. But at the same time, there was this recognition that Man Malki Rabbanan, that here was somebody who was of nobility, regal, in the finest and best sense of that word. The second Rashi also reflects his unique and singular characteristic. The idea that there would be a Melus Shabbatorah which would only be applied intellectually and would not be extended to the world of mitzvos and avodas Hashem, to use the Sifra's much sharper indictment, Noach shelo haya nivra. The contradiction to the very notion of both the toil and the perseverance as well as the immersion of a Melus Batorah. Rabbi Lichtenstein, in one respect, was an extremely complicated person. I would say, probably inaccurately, he was an extremely complicated thinker. He had range, the ability to master many, many disciplines. His range, his ability to integrate them was really something that was singular and maybe even unmatched. But at the same time, he was really a very simple Oved Hashem. The Rav Zatzal used to speak about this a lot. He spoke about it in terms of Reb Chaim and Reb Moshe. I'm sure it was true about himself as well. A certain emunah pshuta that really prevailed among these great intellects, sophisticated Talmidei Chachamim, whose capacity to formulate the most adin, the most subtle kind of distinctions on the one hand, was wedded with a certain simple and basic belief in the Ribbono Shel Olam and sense of themselves as Ovdei Hashem. This is something that was certainly true of Rav Lichtenstein Zatzal. He was somebody who, on the one hand, had all this range and scope, but at the same time understood where the red lines were. And Rabbi Hochberg made allusions to that. It's very important to understand. He was extremely sharp and extremely principled about things which he felt were a corruption of Torah. At the same time that he was able to master and to balance all of these different disciplines, his root was an Amelus Batorah in that respect as well. Therefore, the idea that there could be a Limud Torah, which is Shalom and Aslasos, that dissonance, that compartmentalization, anything other than a full integration and the integrity both of the learning and the Avodas Hashem, was something that was anathema to him as well. I would say that Rav Lichtenstein, as a person, represented and embodied a Melus. He was a persona of a Melus in that respect. And finally, that's also the theme of Im Bechukosai Telechu, both its plural as well as its connection to Chukim. We identify Chukim with the part of Torah which requires Emunah, on the one hand, and also which pushes us to develop an inner logic, a sense of the coherence of all aspects of Torah and how they come together. We don't simply understand Torah right against the background of other cultures. In Bechukosai Telechu tells us that the Torah is what defines and determines. A person really wants to be an Isha Halacha, and someone who's a Melus, whose Yira, whose Yegiya, is going to create in this world of Torah. It has to begin with an appreciation for Chukim. But not only Chukim, but as the Orach Chaim explains, in Bechukosai Telechu, multiple Chukim. An appreciation of the range of Torah, its complexity on the one hand, but also that Kula Miroa Echad Nitnu, its harmony and its unity at the same time. And in that sense, again, Ashreinu, Zachinu, we are all tremendously privileged to know somebody who embodied a Melus immersion in that sense as well. Somebody who was complex or complicated in his thinking, but who was consistent and had full integrity in his Emunah and in his Avodas Hashem. Somebody who could appreciate the range and also at the same time identify and be driven by the unity. Therefore, as we approach the Shloshim, certainly Rabbi Penner referred to the Gemara's discussion of Shloshim, It's absolutely true. The hespedim of a great man can be even mentioned on a Rosh Chodesh, precisely because they are Talmud Torah. But it's the Talmud Torah which leads to a reinforcement of the concept of Amelus, which also leads to Man Malchi Rabbanan on the one hand, and continued devotion to Avodas Hashem on the other. So as we move towards a different phase, certainly it's not the end of Hespedim, but further opportunity for us to rededicate to the themes of Amelus and everything that it implies that is so much a part of the legacy of Moreinu Rabbeinu, Rav Lichtenstein Zatzal. Thank you.
Just express my thanks again to Rosensweig, Rabbi Berman, Rabbi Tenor, Rabbi Schonfeld, all of you for coming. Chazal tell us, Ein nosim nefashos latzadikim ma'aseim heinem zichronam. We don't make monuments, so to speak, for tzadikim. Ma'aseihem, their actions are their zichronim, are their memory. And I would point out that ma'aseihem can also be embodied in each and every one of us. What we take from what we learned tonight, what we take from what we learned from Lichtenstein over the years. There are many things to read, many things to learn, and Zechusa Yogan Aleinu, it should be his Zikaron, he should be a male for all of us.